On April 7, 1945, in San Francisco Bay, a gray naval transport ship docked in silence, bearing an unimaginable cargo. 10 Japanese women, prisoners of war. The women stood motionless on deck, their eyes squinting against the early morning fog, their thin bodies cloaked in rough military-issue coats too large for them. Behind them, the steel silhouette of the USS Benevolence loomed like a ghost bound to memory. For weeks, they had braced for their arrival in what they believed was the heart of enemy cruelty. Their breaths came shallow, lips pressed tight, hearts steeped in dread. All they had heard poisoned whispers among bunkmates. Cruel rumors passed like secrets told them to expect cages, beatings, starvation. But when the gangplank hit the concrete with an echoing clang, the moment stretched long and eerie. Instead of shouting guards or snarling dogs, there were nurses, American nurses, smiling, calm, hands outstretched. Nothing made sense. The women hesitated, their legs stiff from weeks at sea, their minds tangled in disbelief. One by one, they stepped onto American soil, shoes scraping concrete, as if entering another planet. A young nurse with auburn hair approached, eyes soft, holding a steaming cup of coffee. The first woman flinched, but no blow came. Instead, warmth filled her frozen hands. The smell, rich, unfamiliar, pierced her memory. Not of home, but of freedom she never dared to imagine. Behind her, one prisoner whispered, "Is this still war?" The others didn't answer. Around them, the Navy base bustled with quiet order, not chaos, no barbed wire, no weapons drawn, just uniforms in calm rhythm, carefully orchestrated kindness. Silently, their expectations fell away like dust from old shoes. Yet beneath the calm, each woman harbored a single, persistent fear, the price of this illusion. What waited behind this strange civility? Surely there was a catch. There had to be a catch. They were led through the naval facility in a slow procession, flanked not by guards but by curious glances from nurses and sailors who didn't speak, only watched. The scent of iodine, sea salt, and hot bread drifted through the air, disorienting in its gentleness. As they passed a mess hall, one prisoner caught sight of a table, white plates, silver cutlery, milk bottles lined like porcelain soldiers. She blinked, remembering the rice husks she'd swallowed to survive, the stench of latrines and burning rubber. This was theater, she thought, a mirage. When they entered the processing hall, there were no interrogation rooms, only rows of chairs and clipboards gently handed to them, names mispronounced with care, a photograph taken, not a threat, just a record. Yet every smile felt dangerous, every kindness unearned. One woman scratched her wrist raw under her sleeve, better to feel pain than confusion, better to cling to fear than be disarmed by decency, because kindness, they had learned, often came before cruelty. In the barracks assigned to them, the cots were lined neatly, each one with folded blankets and a towel, things so mundane they felt surreal. One woman paused at the sight of a pillow, touching it as if it might vanish. That night, they didn't sleep, couldn't. Beneath flickering ceiling lights and the ticking of an electric clock, they lay awake, whispering fragments of disbelief. One spoke of the soldier who had asked if she preferred chicken or beef. Another recalled the nurse who'd buttoned her coat for her gently, like a mother. These gestures, spoken aloud, felt almost shameful. They had been told Americans hated them, that surrender meant disgrace, that capture brought dishonor worse than death. And yet, here they were, alive and washed and spoken to as people. Each moment upended everything they thought they understood. The war had shattered their world. But this peace, it was breaking them too, in ways they couldn't yet name. In the days that followed, the routine aboard the base became more structured, yet no less baffling. Wake-up calls came not from barked commands but melodic bells. Breakfast was hot, varied, and voluntary. When one woman reached for her bowl too quickly, expecting it to be snatched away, the cook merely smiled and offered her seconds. They were permitted to walk the perimeter, escorted only loosely, as though someone believed they wouldn't run. Some of them did not even want to. The air was cleaner here, the sounds less jarring. One morning they were given pencils and paper, told they could write home. At first, no one moved. Then one woman, Yuki, the youngest, began to write, her lines trembling. Not a message of desperation, but of confusion. "They are kind," she wrote, "or they pretend well. Whichever the truth, the lie felt better than the certainty they had escaped." But even as gentleness persisted, paranoia bloomed like mold in shadow. How could they believe in mercy when their nation had fallen on its knees? What kind of enemy left you with blankets and coffee instead of scars? On the third week, a translator arrived. Her name was Alice Nakamura, an American-born Nisei who spoke perfect Japanese and bore the quiet wariness of someone suspended between worlds. When she entered the barracks, the women instinctively drew together, unsure if she was friend or spy. But Alice did not speak like a jailer. She asked questions gently, clumsily even, as if ashamed of her uniform and unsure of her right to wear it. She translated letters, explained procedures, and offered smiles that never quite reached her eyes. One evening, as cicadas hummed outside and the hall lights flickered soft golden across the linoleum, Alice sat beside one of the elders, Hane, and asked about her village. Hane spoke slowly, her voice strained from years of silence. "We had plum trees," she said. For a long moment, Alice said nothing. Then quietly, "So did my grandmother, in Fresno." In that instant, the war thinned, just barely revealing two women, each holding shattered roots in their hands, unsure which soil would take them back. By the end of the month, spring rain had turned the base's empty parade grounds into soft fields of mud. The women, once too wary to speak, now moved more freely, though never without glances over their shoulders. It was during one of those damp afternoons that the unexpected happened. A radio was placed in their recreation room, an old cathedral-style set, humming to life with a flick of a knob. Scratchy jazz poured forth, alien yet magnetic. Yuki sat closest, her fingers brushing the fabric of a donated cardigan, eyes fixed on the speaker. Then came a voice, smooth, male, speaking flawless Japanese. It was a broadcast from the Office of War Information. Not propaganda, but poetry. Readings from Basho, news of reconstruction, even messages to families still in Japan. The women stilled. For a moment, the war's screams faded. The radio seemed like a bridge to a world that had not burned completely, and yet trust remained elusive. Every comfort now came with a question. What price were they paying simply by surviving this kindly captivity? A month into their stay, the unexpected arrived not through punishment or exile, but through invitation. The women were told they would be taken on a short trip not far, just beyond the gates. Panic surfaced instantly. Was this a transfer? A trick? But no restraints were brought. Instead, they were offered shoes that fit, coats not fraying at the hem. A Navy bus waited, its engine humming steady, door open like the mouth of something too calm to be trusted. As they pulled away from the base, wariness clung to them, stitched into every breath. The bus moved through streets lined not with rubble, but cherry trees just beginning to bloom, their petals so like home it hurt. Finally, they stopped at a school, an American school with wide windows and children's laughter spilling into the air. As the women stepped inside, dozens of small faces turned toward them, unsure, blinking. Then, a teacher offered them crayons. "Draw," she said gently. The oldest woman among them, Takako, picked one up. Red, no blood on it, just color, just wax. It was a world they never believed would want them, and yet, here it was staring back, asking nothing but a name and a line on paper. The simplicity of it made them ache more than any bullet ever had. After the school visit, something imperceptible shifted. The women no longer walked in tight formation. They began to talk openly, not just in whispers, but in full voices laced with cautious wonder. One of them laughed when a sailor dropped his tray in the mess. Another asked Alice whether the ocean they saw from the pier touched Japan too. The guards, what few there were, stopped being guards in any real sense. They nodded in passing, shared chocolate bars, even traded stories. Yet the fear didn't dissolve. It changed. It became a question rather than a certainty. One night, Takako stood alone at the edge of the base, staring through the chain-link fence at the twinkling lights of the city beyond. Her hands gripped the cold wire as if hoping it might answer. Behind her, the other women sang softly a nursery rhyme from childhood, dissonant in this strange peace. They were no longer prisoners. Not really. but neither were they free. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all, that kindness could hold someone just as tightly as chains. As June neared, the official notice came. The women would be relocated. Not as prisoners, they were told, but as civilians under supervision. The news fell with the weight of a second unknown. Where before there had been bars of war, now there would be an open horizon laced with unbearable choices. Some wept, openly, for the first time since capture, not from fear, but from the ache of choosing between a past reduced to rubble and a future they couldn't imagine as their own. They packed their few belongings slowly, each blanket folded with reverence, each toothbrush tucked away like a relic. Before departure, Alice came one final time, her eyes rimmed in red, the translator now friend. Yuki hugged her with the fierceness of someone afraid she'd never feel warmth again. That evening, as the women boarded a new train, headed for a resettlement center in the Midwest, the platform lights cast long shadows behind them. Their footprints faded into the concrete like ghosts, leaving no trail. What remained was something quieter than peace, stranger than war, a place where the enemy had become human, and they themselves no longer knew what it meant to belong. Midway through their journey inland, the train halted at a rural station. Rain fell in thin sheets, tapping against the windows like war memories knocking to be let in. One woman, Misako, looked out and saw a man selling apples from a cart. He was old, eyes crinkled with quiet fatigue, but when he spotted the women inside, he raised one of the apples and smiled. It was such a simple thing, but for Misako, it shattered something inside her. In the camp, apples had been symbols of threat, guards biting into them with sneers, cores tossed into dirt as mockery. Yet here, this old man offered fruit with no malice. She pressed her forehead to the glass, silently aching. Was this what peace offered? Not redemption, but small acts that rewrote old terrors. Behind her, someone whispered, "If they could hate us, why don't they?" The question drifted unanswered, mingling with the rhythm of the train and the steady beat of rain that neither judged nor forgave. By the time the women arrived in Minnesota, the trees had traded spring blossoms for deep green leaves, and the air smelled of wet pine and soil. The resettlement center resembled more a boarding school than a prison. Modest buildings, trimmed lawns, silence punctuated by the buzz of power lines. They were given rooms too, to a space, with desks and calendars and fresh sheets. There were courses, counselors, and pamphlets in broken Japanese. They were told they could work if they wanted, even earn wages. But none of it eased the knot inside. The world outside no longer mirrored the one they had been taught to fear. And yet, the betrayal wasn't theirs alone. It was history's thumbprint smudged across every surface. Each woman bore it in different ways, some through fury, some through silence, and some, like Yuki, by trying to shape a story no one would believe. "We were enemies," she would later write, "but they fed us. We were ghosts, and they gave us mirrors. The war was over, yes, but the war inside them had just begun." In the months that followed, the resettlement center became less a place of confinement and more a space of transformation, though not in the way any official had planned. The women began to fill journals, take morning walks through sunlit fields, and memorize the unfamiliar constellations overhead. Letters were exchanged more often. Some returned, others didn't. No one spoke of going home, not yet. The war's debris lay not in rubble but in memory, and memory obeyed no borders. One evening, Takako placed the red crayon from the school visit on her windowsill. It lay there silently, a fragment of a moment that refused to fade. Misako took up gardening, coaxing tiny sprouts from the cold soil, as if proving something still could grow. And Yuki, whose hands had once trembled writing the word kindness, began teaching English to the others, her voice steadier each day. Yet the weight never left them. It hung in the way they paused before laughing, or flinched at sudden loudspeakers, or stilled when a plane flew overhead. They were no longer defined by the horrors they expected, but by the ghosts they carried into a world too kind to punish and too unknowable to fully trust. Peace had not saved them. It had complicated them, and somewhere in between forgiveness and forgetting, they wandered half grateful, half haunted, and entirely changed. As fall crept in, the Minnesota winds sharpened, and with them came a silence that spoke more loudly than anything before. The novelty of survival had faded. What remained was an ache that lodged itself deep within the women's bones, a longing not for home, but for a sense of self untethered by war. One evening, during a lecture on American civics, Hannah excused herself without explanation. She walked alone to the edge of the lake behind the center, where the surface was glassy, untouched. There, she whispered the names of the dead, names erased from towns now vanished. Her breath clouded in the chill, carried off into the dusk like offerings. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and the sound jolted her back not to grief, but to an unbearable tenderness. They were still alive. That, she realized, was both their burden and their miracle, a survival that demanded they carry on, not as prisoners, not as victims, but as women with stories too heavy for most to hear. The war had ended, but inside each of them, it lingered, asking endlessly what kind of world could contain such cruelty and kindness in the same breath. That question would remain unanswered, echoing softly across time like footsteps over forgotten soil. Years later, some of the women remained in America. Others returned quietly to Japan, now reshaped by war's shadow and the silence of survival. They never convened, never wrote memoirs, never claimed headlines. Their stories scattered, like seeds caught in conflicting winds. Yuki became a schoolteacher in Seattle, still folding origami crayons each morning before class. Takako lived by the sea in Chiba, refusing to speak of the months in America except to say, once, that the blankets there never smelled of fear. Misako died childless, her garden left wild. Somewhere in a museum drawer lies a letter, unsigned, written in hesitant English. We were not soldiers, we were not victims. We were witnesses to a world that chose mercy when it could have chosen revenge. The pen ink has faded, but its meaning hasn't. In a war defined by brutality, their captivity offered no easy redemption, only a glimpse of what might be possible, and the unbearable weight of knowing it was real, but fleeting. Somewhere, in a dusty archive, a black and white photograph remains 10 women standing stiffly on a dock, eyes wary, back straight, the sea behind them and strangeness ahead. No names penned in the margins, no recognition offered by history books, just a frozen moment where war and peace touched through human skin rather than uniform. To those who pass it by, it is just another image from a different time. But for those women, now vanished into the quiet folds of anonymous lives, that moment was everything, a beginning and an end. A place where the world cracked open and showed them something unthinkable, not hatred, but grace. And maybe that is the cruelest echo of all that, in the heart of war, they were given a fleeting glimpse of what the world could be, if only it dared. That glimpse, that unbearable mercy, followed them until their last breath, not as comfort, as reminder. And so, nothing remains. No monument towers where they once stood, no films dramatize their uncertainty, no politician speaks their names at Veterans Day parades. History, in all its weight and noise, forgets the quietest echoes first. Yet the lives those women led between silence and sight, between enemy and ally, were acts of defiance in ways the world was never trained to recognize. They carried no weapons, stormed no beaches, yet they shattered centuries of certainty with the simple act of surviving kindness. In a war that taught nations to dehumanize, they bore witness to a truth the victors themselves sometimes dared not see, that mercy, real mercy, is its own form of resistance, a resistance that leaves no medals, only memory. And long after uniforms are buried and nations rename their wounds, the question still floats through the quiet spaces they inhabited, unspoken yet eternal. What happens to the prisoner when the war is over, but she no longer knows where freedom begins? There are no parades for ghosts, no dates circled in calendars to mark the day the enemy's daughters stepped onto foreign soil and left it changed. But sometimes, in rare moments when fog clings low over San Francisco Bay, or when a red crayon lies forgotten on a shelf deep in a school, there's a whisper, not loud, not even heard, but felt. A memory not of defeat or victory, but of memory itself, the kind that bruises softly and never quite heals. The Japanese women POWs who came expecting chains and found coffee instead did not return home the same. Some never returned at all, but in that eerie middle ground, where war ended and mercy began, they bore witness to something history could not catalogue, the echo of kindness, powerful enough to haunt, not to comfort, to haunt. Because what they saw was not what war taught them, yet it was too beautiful, too fragile, to ever fully trust. And still, it lives quietly in the space between hurt and healing, between silence and song. In the space left by their silence, a truth remains, one not bound by nation or uniform, but traced in the fine lines around tear-stiff eyes, in fingers that flinch from softness, in dreams shaped by things that did not happen. The Japanese women POWs arrived in America expecting cruelty, and what they found was stranger than any battlefield, a confrontation not with death, but with a version of humanity they had not known existed. That encounter, wordless, weightless, terrifying in its gentleness, never left them. It lived inside their gestures, their hesitations, the way they touched their children's hair or stirred their soup just a second too long. To survive war is to survive contrast. And for these women, the contrast was mercy in the shape of a steaming cup, music hummed through radios, a red crayon waiting to be held. These are the things no museum will archive, no history textbook will footnote. And yet, in these quiet mercies, an invisible war was waged, and something sacred was, for a moment, almost won. In the end, their legacy lived quietly in the children they taught, the gardens they tended, the stories they never told but somehow passed on. They became not heroes, not martyrs, but living contradictions, proof that humanity could fracture and still, somehow, prefer repair over ruin. They had witnessed war not only as victims but as observers of what was possible when hatred failed to show up. And though history turned its gaze elsewhere, the truth remained inscribed in their lives like a secret melody only some could hear. The mercy they received was not perfect, not free of context or pain, but it was real, and because of that, it endures not in headlines or history books, but in the quiet way a stranger might choose kindness instead of judgment, grace instead of fear. Somewhere, a woman raises her cup, the steam curling beneath her chin, and feels a warmth she does not question. Somewhere else, a child shades a tree with a red crayon, and in that space, they remain not gone, not fully, just remembered, as mercy's quiet witnesses. And as the last leaf fell outside a classroom window in late autumn, in a town far from Tokyo, far from the war's rage, Yuki, now old, hands spotted with age, voice quiet but unshaken, told a group of students a story with no moral, just fragments. A cold morning, a cup of coffee, a smile she didn't trust and still remembers. She didn't name the war, nor her past. She simply said, "Sometimes the enemy is not what you fear, but what you almost hope for, a kindness you don't know how to accept." The classroom fell silent. No one knew what to ask. She folded a crayon from notebook paper, set it on the table, and left. That paper bird sat on the desk long after the bell rang, long after the students forgot the lesson. But when one child picked it up years later and asked, "Who made this?" the answer was already there in the questions they had never dared ask, and the mercy they were just beginning to understand. So the story ends not with resolution, but with residue, with the echo of lives, lived in the liminal space between enemy and guest, shame and grace. The Japanese women prisoners of war arrived, expecting torment, and instead encountered something far more disorienting: decency. Not perfection, not absolution, but decency. It left no great scars to show the world, only quiet changes in posture, in memory, and in the way each of them measured trust. Most of them disappeared into history's blind spot, swallowed by the silence of a culture that hadn't asked for their story. But that silence is not absence. It is a presence, heavy and intact, waiting in old photographs, in second-hand blankets folded with care, in red crayons long since dull. Their journey was not toward glory nor repentance. It was toward a human truth with no parade, no anthem, only the trembling knowledge that sometimes mercy survives the battlefield, and sometimes that is what haunts the hardest. And somewhere, hidden between the creases of time and memory, is the quietest legacy of all, not written in letters, not etched in stone, but stitched into behaviors so subtle they seem invisible. A hand hesitating before offering help, a mother reminding her daughter to be kind first, firm second, a teacher who never assumes who the villain truly is. These are the inheritances of women who crossed an ocean in shackles of expectation and found themselves unshackled by grace they neither trusted nor forgot. Theirs was not a tale made for glory, but for echo, for the invisible thread that links a steaming cup in wartime to a gesture generations later. And so, when we speak of war, of peace, of what it means to win or to lose, perhaps we should think not of treaties, not of triumphs, but of red crayons and nameless photographs, and ask, what mercy small, flickering, and almost unspeakable might we owe the ghosts who glimpsed the world we still haven't dared to build? Perhaps, in some quiet tomorrow, when old papers are sorted in libraries or a lone photograph is found in a rusted trunk, someone will pause. They may not know the story. They may never learn the names, but they'll feel something in those faces, staring through time, through fog, through memory itself. And in that pause, maybe the legacy lives on, not as fact, but as feeling, not as record, but as question. What if mercy, not vengeance, was the truest rebellion in war? What if those women, in stepping onto that dock so many years ago, carrying nothing but fear and faded uniforms, unknowingly became witnesses to the rarest form of courage, the courage to accept kindness as real, to carry it across oceans of doubt, and to leave it, quietly, in the world they never fully belonged to, but briefly, beautifully, changed? That is their monument, invisible, inescapable, ours to remember or forget. And if ever we dare to forget them, the forgetting will not unwrite the mark they left, because legacy is not what is remembered loudly, but what tugs quietly at conscience, at custom, at the edge of a decision not yet made. In those 10 women's journey from fear to fragile trust, from prisoner to possessor of memory, the shapeless truths of war found quiet shape. Not all suffering screams. Some of it whispers through the cracked spine of a library book, the softened hem of an old coat, the way someone's kindness lingers long after their name is gone. And though history may never carve their faces in stone, we live in the shadow of what they revealed, that even in war's darkest corridors, light found them. And they in turn held that light hesitantly, mournfully, but without letting it go. That is not forgetting, that is legacy, and it waits in silence, in questions, in us. Sometimes, legacy is a doorway left slightly ajar. No fanfare, no inscription, just the unmistakable feeling that someone was here before you, and what they endured opened a path you now walk without realizing. The Japanese women POWs never asked for recognition, and history rarely offered it. But in the quiet corners of the world they once feared, their presence lingers in silence, in softness, in small mercies echoed through time. A steaming cup passed between strangers, a red crayon that colors only gentle things, a whisper against fear that says, there is another way. They did not change the course of nations, but they bore witness to a choice, a tender defiance of cruelty when cruelty was expected. And that choice, elusive and profound, ripples still. Somewhere, a child learns to see the enemy as a person. Somewhere else, kindness is chosen over suspicion. And in those moments, without knowing, the world remembers them not loudly, but truly. And so it is left to whispers. The war is over, the names are gone, the facts catalogued in margins too thin for complexity. But in the tilt of a mother's voice when comforting a frightened child, or the quiet pause before offering trust to a stranger, their story breathes. The Japanese women POWs came fearing chains and left with questions heavier than any iron. Mercy had touched them when they expected pain, and that touch, gentle, bewildering, reverberated through the choices they made, the way they forgave, the silences they kept. This story does not close with certainty or anthem. It ends instead in that uncertain breath between disbelief and belief. A cup set down, a photograph unlabeled, a red crayon left on a teacher's desk, things unchanged, yet never the same. That is the war's quietest rebellion. That is the peace we rarely dare to ask for, and maybe, just maybe, that is what it means to remember. Because remembrance isn't always loud. Sometimes it lives in stillness, in the act of folding a towel carefully, of offering a smile where suspicion once stood. The Japanese women POWs did not reshape geopolitics or headline surrender ceremonies, but but they stood at the fault lines of humanity, quietly carrying its most fragile offering, proof that compassion can survive even when every rule of war says it shouldn't. Their journey begins in silence and ends in echoes, not caught in parades or proclamations, but in the small, sacred spaces where war's shadow meets gentleness. We may not know their names. We may never trace every footstep, but if we have ever chosen decency when fury was easier, if we have ever paused before judgment to offer care instead, that too is their legacy, passed unknowingly, like a thread through time, still strong, still trembling, still waiting for someone to feel it and quietly say, "I remember." In that final whisper of history, where names dissolve and stories scatter like dust across forgotten nations, there rests a truth unclaimed by victory or defeat. The Japanese women POWs did not rewrite the war, but they redefined what it meant to survive it, not by becoming symbols, but by quietly enduring the unbearable and allowing kindness to touch them even as they doubted its form. They never asked the world to remember. Yet in the way grief softens and suspicion sometimes yields to hope, their legacy endures. No fanfare followed them home, no spoken thanks woven into the stories of nations. But in the breath held before kindness, in the silence before a smile, they are there, lingering, watching, waiting not for recognition but for that rare, echoing act of tenderness in a world so practiced in harm. That, perhaps, is their final note, not a cry for remembrance, but a quiet, eternal reminder. Mercy, once given, never truly leaves. So let us not search for their names in gilded halls or carved marble. Let us search for them in echoes, in the shift of light across a faded photo, in the soft steam rising from a shared cup, in the way a child colors within the lines but leaves space for wonder. These women, who braved not just the storm of war but the silence after it, left behind no monuments, only the blueprint of fragile courage, only the question that still whispers across time: what wounds can mercy heal, and what new ones does it leave behind? Their story ends not in victory, nor loss, but in that most human of truths, that to be given unexpected kindness is to carry a lifelong ache for a world that chose, briefly, to be better than expected. And that ache, that echo, is what they gave us. A legacy not shouted from podiums, but handed gently, terribly, from one open heart to the next. And so we close this chapter not with an answer, but with an ache, that delicate, lingering weight of untold stories and silent endurance. The Japanese women POWs did not seek legacy, but they left one anyway, etched not in glory, but in grace. It is there every time we treat the stranger, not with fear, but humanity. It is there in moments of hesitation, of unexpected warmth, of choosing not what is deserved, but what is decent. These women, nameless in textbooks but immortal in the undercurrents of compassion, showed us that war's greatest rebellion is mercy, that the truly radical act is to hold out kindness where none is owed. History may forget the faces, time may rub away the footprints, but the choice, the echo that remains. So the next time we reach for judgment and find understanding instead, let us pause. Let us feel the soft echo of those who once stepped onto enemy soil, trembling, and were met not with hate, but with humanity. This is where their story lives now, not in history's records, but in the margins between expectation and compassion. In every moment someone chooses forgiveness without request, in every small gesture that defies the logic of conflict, they flicker into being once more. A blanket folded gently, a scribbled prayer, a red crayon untouched in a drawer. These are their memorials, ordinary, priceless. They remind us that even in war's wreckage, even in a world ravaged by certainty and vengeance, there was a heartbeat of something else, tender, trembling, and almost real. The Japanese women POWs did not ask us to remember, but they dared to believe just long enough that humanity held more than hatred. The echo of that belief is still sounding, soft and certain, across years and oceans, and if we listen, truly listen, we might hear it rising, not as noise but as a memory, not as a command, but a choice, the choice to be better than we were told to be. That choice, quiet, implausible, and profound, lives on not in the loud declarations of nations, but in the unscripted moments where mercy defies memory. In one final image, blurry with time, a woman bowing slightly before stepping off a train, her shadow stretching long in the twilight of a country that never sought to understand her, yet gave her space to simply be. In that act, no word is spoken, no flag flutters, but something stirs, deeply like the last ripple across still water. The story ends not because the memory has faded, but because its meaning has been passed on to us, in silence, in softness, in choice. And so we leave them there, those 10 women no longer prisoners, not quite free, but forever luminous in the quiet courage of having faced war's darkest promise and found, in its place, a cup of coffee, warm, waiting, merciful. That warmth, once feared, became their inheritance, not of ownership, but of offering, a tender defiance passed silently from hand to hand, generation to generation. In war's aftermath, they bore no medals, but in kitchens and classrooms and gardens across 2 countries, their quiet witness bloomed, not as legend, but as living proof, that amidst ruin, humanity could sometimes remember itself. We close their story not in conclusion, but in continuation, with every gesture that chooses compassion over control, with every heart that learns to trust again, even just a little. The Japanese women POWs stepped into a foreign land expecting torment, and departed carrying something infinitely more dangerous: belief. Belief that kindness could survive the storm. Belief that mercy could outlast memory. And so their legacy is not what they left behind, but what they left within us. A red crayon, a soft towel, a steaming cup, a heart opened by the impossible. These are the memorials that never fade. And perhaps that is all history ever truly asks of us, to carry the unbearable tenderness left unspoken. The Japanese women who once stood on that dock in San Francisco did not rewrite the past, nor cleanse its wounds. But in their silence, in their quiet grace beneath disbelief, they planted something more enduring than victory, a memory of what it meant to meet humanity where war expected none. Their story ends here, not with a monument or a final word, but with an invitation to see mercy where none is required, to remember not names, but choices. The cup filled when it might have been withheld, the crayon left when it might have been confiscated, the smile offered where punishment had been promised. These are the stories that linger, beyond archives, beyond time. And so, as the echo fades, we are left not with endings, but with a single quiet question passed from their trembling hands to ours. When cruelty is easy, will we dare instead to be kind?